Some time ago, a young boy named Bert would wander over a railway bridge near his home in Bundaberg in Queensland, watching the local ibis lazily soaring overhead. He marvelled at the ease with which the bird launched into the air, and marvelled even more how effortlessly it twitched a feather or two simply to maintain flight. He wished he could fly like the ibis. His curiosity knew no bounds and served him well in the following years. This young man grew up to become one of the world's most celebrated aviators, setting and breaking many records for endurance flying heavier than air machines. One of those records was his solo flight from England to Australia in 1928, taking less than 16 days in a single-engine Avro Avian biplane with no navigator, no radio, just an atlas on his knee and a compass to find his way. That aviator was Bert Hinkler. This is part of that story, and it happened at Perth Oval. Sometime before his record-breaking flight, Bert had light-heartedly told his ma that one day he would fly home to Bundaberg from London. And when he did, after completing his record-setting flight, it seemed that every person in Bundaberg came out to see him land. A Bundaberg newspaper reported,
"Shrieks of joy from women announced the first sight of Hinkler. Hinkler's mother and brother anxiously watched the small speck. There were about 20,000 people around the ground, and each yelled in joy as the machine circled high above the recreation ground. He passed over the ground, still high up, and then swooped down and landed gracefully. The crowd rushed over to the plane and surrounded it. The crowds went wild with excitement. The people at last got hold of Hinkler. They hoisted him on their shoulders, and amid great excitement and cheers carried him towards the official platform. Hinkler did not appear at all comfortable, and apparently was having a rougher ride than he had throughout the whole trip from England."
Little did Hinkler know what was about to happen. His triumphant flight attracted the attention not only of the Australian population, but of the Prime Minister as well. Part of his message read,
"On behalf of the Government of the Commonwealth and the people of Australia, I desire to convey to you our warmest congratulations on the successful conclusion of your flight from England to Australia. I wish also to express the hope that Government may have the opportunity of welcoming you in person at the seat of Government at an early date."
Bert's sense of obligation to the people of Australia was significant, and so, after realising that the whole country wanted to congratulate him, he felt he had to fly on to every state to say thank you to everybody for being so kind. And so he arrived in Perth at the end of his visits to every other capital city.
The Argus newspaper in Melbourne reported that a crowd of 20,000 persons welcomed Mr. Bert Hinkler on his arrival in Perth, 10 seconds after the scheduled time this afternoon. He made a perfect landing and was most enthusiastically greeted when driven around the Oval in a motor car. Mr. Wilcock, the acting Premier, said that the warmth of the reception should be sufficient to show Mr. Hinkler how the state appreciated his wonderful flight.
Bert could not believe the fuss and commotion everyone was making. He was asked to address the people of Perth from radio station 6WF. He had to wear a penguin suit, as he called it, instead of a flying suit. In his speech, he thanked the people of Perth and told them that he was very happy that his wife, Nance, would be joining him in a couple of days when the mailboat Orama docked in Fremantle. He then went on to describe the highlights of his journey.
"I hate making speeches or addresses, and it is not an easy job to describe my flight from England to Australia, because the papers have told you practically everything there is to be told about it. You know all about my great little bus, and how I managed to make good time and get through with everything in tip-top order and condition. Now that the job is done, I can best bring to mind the highlights of the trip. What a appeared to me to be the big things. There was the start. It was one of those grey, murky mornings when I hopped off from Croydon Aerodrome in England, but the warmth of my fellow flyers' good wishes and the knowledge that I had the most trustworthy bus and engine in the world dispelled any qualms I may have had.
Bert considered that his work in aviation was pioneering work, which he saw as hard, with many sacrifices and setbacks and scares. During his flight, he was arrested in Rome, having mistakenly landed his Avro in a military aerodrome. After being bailed out by the British consul, he flew from Rome to Malta, then through Libya and on to the coastal city of Tobruk. However, conditions prevented him from reaching Tobruk and he had to land in the desert. He was met by some Bedouins, which, he said, was a bit scary. He thought it was probably the first time they had seen a plane. But he said they were as nice as pie and even helped haul his plane on to harder ground so that he could take off again. The next few legs of his journey caused him deep anxiety.
It was anything but comfortable when I struck the big jungle fires on the way to Rangoon, and I don't mind admitting that the storms I ran into over the Malay Peninsula and the Dutch East Indies were not the best companions in the air.
At one point, he had to put down short of Beamer, which was a scheduled stopover. Some natives found him and offered him shelter in their hut for the night. He describes it as a rotten night with the mosquitoes nearly eating him alive. He was constantly bitten and considered it very inconvenient.
Those mosquitoes at Beamer are the world's worst. I can sleep in most places and at most times, but those mosquitoes were just too much for me. These were the bad times, but they were in the minority. All things considered, the going was mighty good.
He was very glad to leave Beamer at dawn for the 900-mile trip to Darwin. Bert described the last section of his flight to the Age newspaper.
I had a tricky climb with a full load out of the mountains and then set out for the open sea. I was over the Timor Sea for about 5 hours, and my first sight of Australia, Bathurst Island, caused great joy in the cockpit.
Hinkler had no idea what might be waiting for him in Darwin, but hoped there would be a few people to shake his hand on arrival. Darwin expected him at 2 p.m, but it wasn't until almost 4 anxious hours later that Hinkler finally dropped out of the skies for a safe landing. He was now the most celebrated aviator in the world, having just completed an incredible and record-breaking solo flight. Bert described his passion and how he felt about flying.
I can assure those unacquainted with flying that to sit in the snug little cockpit, to see the world rolling away below, to hear the sweet even note of the engine, well, to me, flying, this is the salt of life. You have every faith in your bus. The compass points the way, and you know that at every landing place along the route there are friends to meet you. The Cirrus ran perfectly the whole way, and the job was a most enjoyable success. Of course, I was pleased. It was good to be able to do something for one's country. I tried, I succeeded. That my fellow Australians appreciated my effort makes me the happier.
Before flying to Perth to thank the people, Bert contacted a friend from the war, Norm Brearley, also a pilot, who sent him some maps to look over before he left Melbourne. They selected an area of open ground called Perth Oval. They weren't sure how many would be interested in being at the Oval to see him arrive, but they wanted to make sure the people of Perth didn't have to travel far from the centre of town. Norm Brearley felt that an official escort to the Oval would be a suitable gesture to acknowledge Bert's unequalled flight. He arranged for 2 pilots to join him and meet Bert coming in over the ranges. As the 3 planes approached Perth, the 2 escorts peeled away and returned to Maylands Aerodrome. Bert then flew in over a suburb called Mount Lawley. There were people perched on rooftops and even on telegraph poles, waving and cheering. The crowd was huge. Officials numbered the crowd at over 20,000 in the ground, with an equal number outside. Bert circled the Oval a number of times to get his bearings. He flew over one of the most magnificent homes in Perth. He made a very sharp turn just above the trees before setting down, stopping just short of the fence at the other end. Spectators went crazy with excitement, running out to the plane from everywhere. The police had to quickly cordon off the area to prevent any possible damage to the plane by the excited spectators. Bert was overwhelmed by all the attention. He was met by the Premier and other officials and was asked to make a speech. He was not comfortable talking to a crowd of people, which continued to cheer and clap, the noise almost blocking out Bert's speech. He thanked the people of Perth and Western Australia for a welcome he will remember for as long as he lives. Bert was taken for several circuits of the Oval in an open car, which added to his discomfort. He wished Nance was with him to share all the attention. Eventually, he returned to his aircraft to hangar it at Maylands. He admitted that he felt much more at ease when he was flying. As the time for Nance's arrival came closer, Bert could hardly contain his excitement. He and Nance had been separated for such a long time. The Argus newspaper in Melbourne reported on his eagerness when he finally met up with her when the ship berthed.
Mr. Bert Hinkler was the first man to board the Orama from the wharf at Fremantle this morning to greet his wife. Helped by a police sergeant, he jumped across the space between the quay and the ship before the Orama had properly berthed.
The Chronicle newspaper in Adelaide described a very excited and enthusiastic Mr. Hinkler upon boarding the vessel looking for his wife.
Mr. Hinkler ascended the decks of the vessel looking for his wife on each. Behind him trailed a crowd of enthusiastic passengers, pressmen and photographers. Then a steward intimated that Mrs. Hinkler was awaiting him in her cabin suite. Down the passage rushed Mr. Hinkler, the steward and one pressman. Other stewards barred the rest of the crowd back. Mr. Hinkler rushed through the suite door. His wife ran to meet him, and the door closed.
Bert's excitement at the arrival of Nance was to be shared with the people of Perth, who wanted to thank him in their own way. The few days after Nance's arrival, and following Bert's spectacular arrival in Perth, were crammed with numerous civic invitations, congratulatory dinners and awards. The West Australian wrote,
Citizens of Perth went in thousands to the Prince of Wales Theatre yesterday afternoon when a civic reception was tendered to Mr. and Mrs. Bert Hinkler. Outside the theatre, just prior to the arrival of the airman, a large crowd gathered, and as he greeted the Mayor of Perth, Mr. J.T. Franklin, on the theatre step, a loud cheer was raised. Inside the hall, every seat was occupied, and latecomers were standing in the aisles. Rarely has such a crowd been seen at a civic reception in Perth.
There was also a parliamentary lunch, a visit to Perth Boys' School where he was swamped by a very excited group of young schoolboys. Bert's flight was sponsored by Shell and the company gave him a huge reception at the Young Australia League ballroom. There were many other events in recognition of his great journey. After these exhausting days in Perth, Bert and Nance planned to fly back to Bundaberg together after he removed the extra fuel tank from his plane so there was room for her.
I venture to say that in 20 years' time, the aeroplane will be almost as familiar a figure in our scheme of things as the motor car is today. Aviation has a lot to thank Australia for. Hawker, the Smith brothers, Pera and McIntosh, Sidney Pickles and Kinkford Smith, and many other excellent pilots you have right here in your own midst. These good Australians have done and are doing big things in the air. And I am quite sure that there are many other Australians who will carry on the good work.
Despite the joy and happiness, the congratulations and official events, there was one downside: the press. The press had not been kind to Bert. During his flight, and especially afterwards, he suffered the humiliation of being ridiculed and was accused of doing it just as a foolish stunt.
In March of 1928, the Sydney Morning Herald reported that a significant portion of the public viewed Hinkler's flight as a stunt. Despite his incredible achievement and the official accolades he received, Hinkler continued to deny that his flight was a stunt.
During the same month, the Melbourne Argus quoted Hinkler, It must not be assumed that my flight was in the name of a stunt. The flight I made could be accomplished by another aviator with capable tools. If I have done nothing more than to open the eyes of Britons and Australians to the possibilities of an aerial service between Britain and Australia, my flight will have accomplished its main objective.
Bert Hinkler was a very modest, unassuming man who did not look for all the attention he received, good or bad. His interest was centred around what aviation could do for Australia and the British Empire, and frequently spoke about these advantages in the many speeches he made. Nevertheless, the press persevered with its discussion as to whether or not his flight was a stunt.
The Sydney Morning Herald, March 1928, quoted the air navigation regulations in force at the time, which stated that seaplanes, amphibians or flying boats must be used if flying over water for more than 50 miles. The article went on to say that 2 or more stages of Hinkler's flight were over water for distances far greater than 50 miles, which gave rise to comments in the press that his flight was a stunt.
But Bert took it all in his stride. He was a proud Australian and proud of what he had achieved for all Australians. His hope was that he would be remembered long into the future and not by just today's news. Here today and gone tomorrow. He had already acknowledged his fellow Australians who also achieved amazing record-breaking flights and were well known amongst the people. Bert wondered if he himself would be remembered for his own record-breaking flights. He felt that his journey might be overshadowed by so many other great achievements and resolved to continue his pioneering flights and cement his place in aviation history. But how does Perth remember him almost 100 years later?
From coast to coast we all can boast and sing a toast to one who's made a name for being game. He was born with wings as fine as any bird that flies. A lucky star guides him afar. Hustling Hinkler up in the sky, fair or windy, he's flying high. Peerless, fearless, knows every cloud, the kind of a son makes a mother feel proud. Bustling Hinkler rides all alone in a little plane all his own. Hustling Hinkler showed them the way, and he's the hero of the day. This Aussie son set out for fun, he had no thought of fear, and now he's home from all the foe. The whole world's mighty proud of him, as proud as it can be, and now he's here. Come on folks, let's give a cheer. Hustling Hinkler up in the sky, fair or windy, he's flying high. Fearless, fearless, knows every cloud, the kind of a son makes a mother feel proud. Bustling Hinkler rides all alone in a little plane all his own. Hustling Hinkler showed them the way, and he's the hero of the day. Bustling Hinkler rides all alone in a little plane all his own. Hustling Hinkler showed them the way, and he's the hero of the day.